get to the nitty gritty. And actually, if you go to our module, you'll see module 3, which is a draft of your procedures and field work. And then you'll see these 2 links, right, that will open up 2 PDF files. And I've already done that. So what I wanted to show you here is basically my mocked up version of this, and hopefully kind of hone in on certain pieces of that. So let me open up both of these documents. And so you see I annotate all over the place. So let me bring that closer here. Okay. And so here is your final project guidelines, so basically you see the entire project here, and I'll go over each piece each time we have information. But if we click over here, so basically this is the piece that we're doing for milestone 1. And then as we continue to go through areas, then you'll see all the other pieces. So right, the second milestone, and then the third milestone, which is the memos, and then the final submission, which is not exactly the compilation of all 3 milestones. There's a bit of additional information there in that your memos, you're offering more feedback and recommendation, and the rubric is a bit different. So my first bit of advice is to follow the rubric. So in your submissions, you should have, and so for the final milestone, you'll have a lengthy piece, but you should have for every one of these factors some type of subheading that's clear, that we can, that it would be easy for me to grade, and also ensure that you've addressed each part. So what I want to do is kind of go through our first milestone. So it gives you some introduction about auditing and the importance of it in business, but more importantly, it actually tells you that auditors have professional judgment. So if you're going to use professional judgment, we call it professional skepticism, make sure that you're also adding the auditing standard from the PCAOB about professional judgments, or the AICPA. And so, because that's the regulatory bodies that help us. Notice we're not only auditing, the financial statements, we're also auditing the forecast. In this milestone, you're taking the role of an internal auditor. So internal auditors are going to ensure that all the processes are in place, the internal controls are in place, and so hopefully the lead schedules that are prepared for the audit are correct and pretty seamless, so that the audit could A, cost less, and B, run smoothly, and the end result of the audit is an unqualified opinion, or a clean opinion. Notice that the auditor has to be fair, unbiased, and the financial statements have to be materially correct. So an unqualified opinion tells you that an audit is free of material misstatement, and materiality is determined, and then you have what's known as a tolerable misstatement, which I believe was in the overview of our module this week. So basically what you're going to do here in module 1 is how are you planning the audit? And so then you're going to communicate this result. So you are doing the internal audit staff, and I recommend the IIA, the Institute of Internal Auditors, as another tool that you can use. And basically you're going to get, for any one of these companies, I mean, I love, probably with the exception of Sears, and Kroger, they're not here, but Amazon, Target, and Walmart are very good options, and most students are familiar with them. And you're going to get the last 2 years of financial statements from the SEC Edgar site. So SEC Edgar. And so that's like an electronic data gathering and retrieval system from the SEC, and you can grab those financial statements. And basically the first page of item 8 in an SEC 10K or 10K is the audit opinion, and that's the audit report. Students get confused with that, And so what you're doing is you're going to look at more a revenue audit and a cash audit, as you'll learn, and a business risk, kind of assessing that. And so that's where the audit risk model will come in quite handy. Okay, so what you are to do is submit a draft of those procedures that you're doing in the audit process. And you're going to, like how you would do, you're going to describe them. And analytical procedures is key here. So analytical procedures is typically done at the beginning, right? So if you're going to accept the client. So basically what that is horizontal and vertical financial statements, common size financials. So the biggest part of analytical procedures are ratio analysis, horizontal, and vertical common size financial statement analysis. And by common size, we mean we're dividing by something, right? Especially if you're going to do a comparison to the industry, which you're going to see that in another milestone. So that is what analytical procedures mean. And that is hopefully what you're going to learn about, right? So let's keep going on. And so you're going to see how you're going to investigate selected business transaction, which is really cash and revenue. And then you're going to create a test to assess that management assertion that I showed you earlier. So audit risk model is important in here because you're assessing risk. So that's audit risks equals control risk, inherent risk, and detection risk. And then also management assertions like existence, completeness, disclosure, and presentation. That is what you're discussing. So the easiest way I would say to approach this is obviously you have all of the questions. So, and then you'll see this correspond. So procedures describe how the audit process is going, right? And then what steps would you take? So what we're looking to get this proficiency level here is that you're stating the audit process steps. Okay, so if we've already accepted the client, now we're going to conduct analytical procedures, goes through each step, then we're going to do field work, which is where auditors are actually at the client site collecting evidence. And we know that evidence has to be sufficient and appropriate. And so you're going to describe each of those process. And in your incorporation is your analytical procedures. So there you're going to discuss, you might do some ratio analysis, probably liquidity ratios and, maybe some profitability ratios. And then you're going to say, this is your conduction of basically you performing the analytical procedures of those 2 years and seeing any variances that might need to be investigated, right? And so then you're going to say the steps. So this has to be particular. Specificity is the key point here, right? So what steps are you going to do to review the financials? So you're going to probably, let's say for revenue, right? And a cash, that is part of the sales cycle. So for revenue, you are going to probably get a general ledger detail or conduct a continuous audit by accessing the population, which is the entire audit, everything in the audit, right? Every single transaction within the audit. So you're probably going to get the general ledger, get the details of transactions, possibly randomly select a representative sample if you're not doing continuous audit, to then review the supporting documentation. So if we know that for revenue, it has to be earned. There are 5 characteristics that have to be sufficed by the FASB codification, that in order for us to record the revenue. So one of those has to be, that we're no longer liable. So it's a contract between the company and the customer. So you would describe that. And then what would be your plan to utilize these procedures? Well, if you're looking at transactions, right, then you're going to, these transactions, you're looking at the financial statements and you're trying to drill down into the transactions, then maybe you would say you're going to take your analytical procedures and any large variances over X percentage would be utilized, you would look into further. And maybe that's how you determine your high risk business transactions. Revenue is customary to always be high risk, right? And typically what happens is that auditors fail to check, all of the items, and then basically the client or the company is recording revenue before it's earned. And then what you're going to do is just say the appropriate procedures to review these high risk transactions. And so for example, for cash, it might be, okay, as an auditor during field work, you're going to give the client what's known as a PBC provided by client. You're going to give them a list of information that you want, and basically you're going to review that. And so that could be part of what you're saying here, that you're going to review a bank reconciliation that you requested, and you're going to review outstanding checks for cash. And for revenue, you're going to review every transaction if you're doing a continuous audit or a sample size to see that the revenue was truly earned, that the proper documentation was there, such as, the purchase order, the sales order came in, we shipped out the items, and then we recorded the revenue. And then what would you need? And so that would be the source documents that are needed in order to investigate the cash or revenue. And then could you convey that information through charts? Well, yes. Or what other supporting documentation? Probably your work papers, right? So as an auditor, our work papers are our evidence, and that needs to be sufficient and appropriate. So possibly, you would have it conveyed in our work papers. And then yes, charts could be available to show possibly the variances or any large spikes or outliers in the data. So, and then lastly, you're going to create a test to assess and the appropriate management assertions. So that could be a substantive test of account balance or a substantive test of account transactions or details. And in this case, typically we do like account balance for cash, and we do transaction details for revenue. So the way to focus your paper, I would say, is you're going to start with description of procedures or audit procedures, just, and then you're going to go through that audit process and the steps in the audit process, and then basically stating, okay, you're looking at analytical procedures such as variance analysis by way of year-over-year change, or you're going to look at common size financials from a horizontal level, so comparing the 2 years, or from a vertical level, comparing that entire year. Then you're going to have another subheading in your APA document that says, explanation of procedures, let's say. And here you're going to explain those procedures, or maybe you'll say, procedures for cash and revenue, high risk transactions. So that would be another subheading. And then here you're going to explain those procedures, and basically that's right up here, right? The procedures for this piece, so for part B. And then lastly, you're going to possibly say substantive test, and then you're going to create that test, whether it's, and describe it. So for example, you're going to review the bank reconciliation and ensure deposits in transit have been deposited and outstanding checks have been, have subsequently been cashed to show that the balance is valid. And lastly, obviously, you want to make sure that you have citations and that they're in proper APA format, and that the organization of your paper in its entirety has all of the APA functionality, right? So you're making sure that you do that correctly. But basically, in this milestone is you're just talking about the audit procedures and what you're going to do, the entire audit process, steps 1 through 5, and then you're going to actually take that process and say, okay, this is how I'm going to drill down into cash and revenue, because those are high risk transactions, and there we need to do a bit more work to obtain evidence that is sufficient and appropriate for us to issue an unqualified opinion, or sufficient for the opinion that we issued. And then lastly, create a test. And now for this could also be a test of internal controls as well. You can actually do a walkthrough and say you are going to test the handling of deposits. So that, I would say the best way to start is make sure you have a subheading for each, articulation of response, you don't need one obviously, but for these 3, and that each of these 3, you are answering all of the questions within that. So for your first part, for description of the audit process, you want to make sure you're addressing all of these main concerns. And then the explanation of the procedures for cash and revenue, you're going to address these 2. And students get, kind of lose a forest for the trees. So I think if you have an outline that is quite helpful and some, information as to what you want to state, then you'll ensure that you have all of the, steps completed and earn as many points as possible. The more that you work on this piece, and hopefully the less feedback you get, then it'll be easier to incorporate that into the next milestone or into the final submission. So what I recommend is always looking at the rubric first, because that's how I'm going to grade you, and then ensuring that you've addressed that, and that the biggest piece is there's no details. So for example, when students explain, let's say, the high risk business transactions, they'll take pieces that from this video and say, oh, they're just, revenue is always high risk, so we have to audit it. Well, that's not enough detail, so you can go into, FASB codification changed in 2014 and kind of made it a little bit more stringent for revenue to be recorded, because there's 5 different steps that have to go through the contract between the client, the customer and the organization. So you want to make sure, things of that nature. So you're kind of giving some explanation as to that. And then substantive testing here, you want to make sure, or test of internal controls, but I would say substantive testing is probably more accurate here, but that doesn't mean that internal controls is not. So it's not mutually exclusive, but you want to make sure that you're giving ample detail. So I know I went through that quite